Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special edition of Sir Hunt on X. Today, live from Ezzard Charles Park in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America. Hope everyone had themselves a wonderful 5th of May 2025 and a wonderful 3-day weekend prior. And I am here today at a historical mount here in Cincinnati called Ezzard Charles Park, one of the premier marts in Cincinnati, honored for the late standout boxer Ezzard Charles. I come here today because it was 78 years ago today, here down the street at Music Hall, where Ezzard Charles had probably one of his finest hours in the early stages of his career. The second of his 3-fight series with Archie Moore that took place at Music Hall, where he had to come from behind to win by a majority decision to put his place among the all-time great light heavyweights. Ezzard Charles, we talk about the community responsibility and his work in and out of the boxing fraternity is shown here as this park was named after him in the year of 2022 to honor him. There's always all kinds of events here, but today is about what he did here 80 years ago at Music Hall in Cincinnati when he beat Archie Moore. Those in the fight game know he and Archie Moore are two of the 5 greatest light heavyweights of all time, and at that, and their place in history is secure. But it was today they embarked in one of the high-profile light heavyweight fights in boxing history. So it was Ezzard Charles versus Archie Moore. The fight was a rematch after what took place in the previous fight where Charles won the unanimous decision. And basically, what's up, Brian Rowe? I see you out there. Hope you're doing good. Hope everyone out there has this wonderful day. Ezzard Charles was a grit and grind fighter, same with Archie Moore, at their times in light heavyweight boxing history when consider the fact at a time when guys like them couldn't get title shots, they had to work and get it the hard way. That was both Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. Ezzard Charles was a relentless fighter, very aggressive, but also very slick in the same sentence. His ability to hit and not get hit, but also stay aggressive in the same time was his mantra. You talk about his opponent, the standout, the late Archie Moore, one of the premier punchers of his era, 130 plus career knockouts, a record that's not going to be touched. So it was 78 years ago today over there at Music Hall in front of a sold out 5,000 fans in Cincinnati at the Music Hall that the second of their trilogy took place. It was a rematch of what Archie Moore felt he was slighted in the first fight. So we go to the second fight. In this particular fight, it started out with Ezzard Charles basically getting off to a slower start and Moore, after losing the first time, getting off to a faster start. And his fight was very much even through the first 6 rounds of this particular fight. Then we fast forwarded to the 7th round to where we start to see the difference between the two fighters, and that was Ezzard Charles and his long ability and his ability to gradually slow you down and wear you down, take over. And that's what happened here when he got the knockdown off the body shot in the late rounds of the fight. And as the fight continued to war on, Charles started to slow Marciano down to where it was fat at Ezzard Charles' pace. Ezzard Charles was real good at getting you to fight at your pace and knowing that Archie Moore was one of the all-time premier punchers of that time. How do you take away the guy's power? You go to his body. That's what Ezzard Charles started to do in the later rounds of that particular fight. And what happened was, as that fight wore on, the Ezzard Charles and started to wear down Archie Moore and started to pull away as the fight wore on. And as the fight wore on, the fight Archie Charles started to take over. And when the decision was announced, it was a majority decision win for Ezzard Charles. The second of their 3-fight series, which took place 80 years ago today at Music Hall in Cincinnati. Their place in history is secure. I mean, you talk about probably 2 of the 4 greatest light heavyweights of all time, Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. Some people say the top 2. You probably throw a Billy Conn in there, a Tommy Lauren, maybe guys like Bob Foster, Michael Spinks, Harry Greb, Gene Tunney, among many others. But there's a wide consensus that the 2 greatest light heavyweights to ever lace them up is Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore. Of course, there's always an ongoing debate as to who the greater light heavyweight of all time is. It's like who do you want, the greater peak or the greater longevity? Archie Moore was probably a case of a fighter who got greater when his career went on, but Charles was a case of a guy who had a greater peak of the 2 because when he's at his peak, he fought some of the best guys and beat them multiple times. You're talking about the 3 wins over Archie Moore. He had 2 wins over standouts like Charlie Burley and Joey Maxim. If you know, Joey Maxim was the one who retired Sugar Ray Robinson on the stool due to heat exhaustion, among many others. So it's always going to be an ongoing debate. Longevity versus greater peak. Widely considered the greatest light heavyweight of all time is this guy's statue right here, the great Ezzard Charles. Now, he did have the 3 wins over Moore. That's the tipping point, and that was basically where some people would give him the nod. This particular fight, nearly 8 decades ago, Charles and Moore engaged in one of the two of the 3 fights over here. And in the second fight, it was basically the best fight of the trilogy because it was a case of both guys giving it their all early. But when it came down to the nitty gritty and when it needed to come down to win, it was Ezzard Charles with a body shot that floored him late in the fight and then just taking it over there to where he would take control of the fight and seize a majority decision win. Now, let me remind the fight followers out there, back then it was the round system, not the point system. So it's always going to be chaos as to who really won it in terms of the rounds and the fight. And it was, at that time, Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore fighting in the round system. Moore felt he was slighted, but the Charles camp felt they did win the fight. Now, there was controversy that ensued after the fight where the rumors were floating around that Archie Moore flunked a PED test. Nothing can be confirmed and proven to this day, but that's what the claim was. Ezzard Charles said a particular case of where he felt like his arms were about to rip off because he thought Moore's punches, even though as brutal of a puncher as Archie Moore was, he felt like they were worse than what they were simply because of Moore's ability to hit you. But of course, it was revealed later on that Moore flunked a PED test, which nobody knew about. Of course, back then, you couldn't tell who was on PEDs or not. But Archie Moore, you're talking about Archie Moore, one of the premier punchers in boxing history. And Ezzard Charles felt it. So a year later, the second fight controversy here sparked off the end of the trilogy that took place in northeastern Ohio, up there in Cleveland. And what happened there was Ezzard Charles took over and showed why he had the distinction of the greatest light heavyweight in boxing history. And he won the fight by a stoppage in the late rounds. So that was the trilogy of Ezzard Charles versus Archie Moore. It was 8 decades ago today, down the road at Music Hall, where this man right here, Ezzard Charles, got probably the high point of his career at the time when he beat Archie Moore on a majority decision to move on the ranks in the heavyweight division. Of course, he would continue to move up the ladder. You know the story there. Unable to get a title shot because of bad business reasons. So what does Ezzard Charles do? He starting makes a move up to the heavyweight division and starts to pursue a heavyweight title there. Has an epic 4-fight series with Jersey Joe Walcott. With the first of the 4 fights, Charles would win the heavyweight championship from Walcott after it was vacated by Joe Louis because Joe Louis retired. Got involved in a couple more fights with Walcott. Made at least 5 successful title defenses, which included a win over Joe Louis, albeit faded Joe Louis. But still, it was the biggest name on Ezzard Charles' resume. And Ezzard Charles would continue to make 4 more successful title defenses after the Louis fight before he would lose to Jersey Joe Walcott twice more. He would have 2 more title shots against Rocky Marciano, the unbeaten standout that took place at the tail end of Charles' career, and especially Rocky Marciano's, which we know Marciano retired subsequently after the fights. But Ezzard Charles' crowning moment in those 2 fights came in the second fight when he fought Rocky Marciano. Was he came darn close to having the fight stop simply because because Rocky Marciano's face was starting to get cut up and sliced up to where the fight was going to eventually be stopped. And Ezzard Charles had control of the fight at the point when he had him cut. The problem was Rocky Marciano buckled down. And when Rocky Marciano started to buckle down, the fight was basically Marciano's to lose. And he basically went on to win the unanimous decision on a 15-round scheduled fight. Ezzard Charles was the only fighter during the Rocky Marciano era and his reign as a heavyweight champion to go 15 full rounds with Rocky Marciano. That should tell you what how tough of a fighter Ezzard Charles was. Now I've always talked about in the past about his history here. You know, the park here, there's a mural down the street here in Cincinnati, about significantly big. I mean, I've shared it on the social media platforms. I will share it again after the show. And it was the street here named after him right across from me. Of course, this is the park. These here are the Ezzard Charles apartments. So the legacy of Ezzard Charles stands out second to none to this day, and it's still a lasting impact. His place in light heavyweight history, you can talk about all the great light heavyweights you want, but Ezzard Charles probably stands out among the highest out of all of them. Where you consider he maybe had not the greatest peak. Maybe a guy like Billy Conn had the greatest peak, but Charles might have had the longest peak of any light heavyweight in the history of that division. We consider the run he had during his 19 years as a fighter, especially the first 9 of it at the light heavyweight division. You talk about the 3 wins over Archie Moore. He had 2 others over standouts like Joey Maxim, Charlie Birdie, even beat a guy like Teddy Yarbrough once upon a time who was a standout. Ezzard Charles just demolished him. And then he moved up to heavyweight, and his place in history is forever secure. His legacy here, still second to none, because you can see it still has a lasting impact. The park, the mural, the streets, everywhere you go on the west end of Cincinnati, you can't go to the west end of Cincinnati without even seeing anything related to the standout, the great Ezzard Charles. And his legacy is forever secure. Now, on the flip side, when you talk about the guy he beat here in Cincinnati, Archie Moore, his place is also secure. I mean, arguably a top 2 or 3 all-time great light heavyweight. Over 190 wins, over 130 knockouts, something that's never going to be touched or amassed ever again in boxing history, because no one fights the way Archie Moore did in terms of longevity. He was a guy that got better and better and better, and he finally hit pay dirt at the end of age 39 when he beat Joey Maxim to win the light heavyweight championship. Himself tried a couple chances at the heavyweight title, lost to guys like Rocky Marciano, Floyd Patterson, and Cassius Clay, later to be known as Muhammad Ali. But his place in history, like Charles, is secure. Transitioned to become an actor later on, also became a trainer, most notably when George Foreman came back into the sport of boxing. Foreman called on Archie Moore to guide him, which was the perfect way, because Moore, Foreman was going to fight into his late 30s and early 40s, where Archie Moore was successful in his career. So Archie Moore transitioned from a fighter to trainer and was able to guide Foreman throughout the second half of his career when he came back in 87. And some people will credit Moore for Foreman's comeback. You talk about one of the all-time brilliant minds in boxing history when you talk about Archie Moore. I mean, he did it as a fighter. He did it as a trainer. Also, sometimes as a commentator and analyst. He did it all. He's seen it all. He knew it all. That's why they called him the old mongoose, simply because he was one of the better ones we had at the time. Just a standout light heavyweight. Just the 3 times he fought Ezzard Charles was just a better man all 3 times. The one here is always up for debate. Of course, there's controversy as to what happened with him after the fight when he succumbed to PEDs. But at the end of the day, Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore, their place in light heavyweight history is forever secure. I mean, talking about 2 of the top 3 or 4 of all time. I mean, it's hard to argue against it. Some people with a recency bias want to throw some of the modern names. They couldn't have a legacy what this guy had, or even the guy he beat, Archie Moore, had, because they did it for a longer period of time, at the highest level for the longest period of time, both Moore and Charles, and that was the biggest difference. That's why their places stand out. Now we talk about some of the great athletes here in Cincinnati, because I have a lot of people that ask me this a lot. This is number 1. I mean, what can you say? The mural, the street, the legacy. They changed the park after him just a couple years ago. This is number 1 when it comes to Cincinnati sports and Cincinnati athletes. His iconism is second to none. I've gone to details. I can go deeper more into details. When you talk about community responsibility, that's what Ezzard Charles did. By the way, shout out Michael Yates. Shout out Shawnette Lewis. Hope you both are doing well. But Ezzard Charles' place in Cincinnati sports history, number 1, in my opinion, bar none. We talk about his place, his ability to impact the community. That's what he did. They have events here that honor him year in and year out in this particular area. So his place in Cincinnati sports history is secure. When you talk about some of the Other Cincinnati sports icons, of course, the other boxer that came out of this area, the standout Aaron Pryor, of course, the outstanding junior welterweight, had the 2 fights of Alexis Arguello, beat guys like Antonio Cervantes along the way. We talk about baseball. Of course, the standout is Johnny Bench, arguably the greatest catcher in baseball history. His one-time teammate, Joe Morgan, the shortstop alongside of him in the back-to-back Red Machine in 75 and 76. Of course, fast forward later, Barry Larkin, the shortstop who was a key piece of the 1990 World Series, has a statue and a street named after him alongside the banks of Cincinnati. If you talk about the sport of football, of course, the greatest left tackle, maybe in NFL history, but at least in Cincinnati's Bengals history, Anthony Munoz, a standout guy who still has charity work and does everything here. His teammate, the standout quarterback, Ken Anderson, also there. The guy should be in the Hall of Fame. His numbers are pretty much said it all. His impact on Cincinnati sports, along with Munoz, just like Ezzard Charles, still lives on to this day. Their place is second to none. And the capper is down the street here, a fellow that lit up the Cincinnati soccer and Cincinnati skyline. We talk about FC Cincinnati soccer, the great Luciano Lucho Acosta, one of the premier athletes who knew the Cincinnati vibe, and just the vibe just electrified it. And just when they go to TQL Stadium, when he was here, it was second to none. It was a highlight reel to himself. He knew how to draw a crowd. So his stature in Cincinnati sports is definitely iconic. And of course, maybe the one closest to Ezzard Charles, the Big O, Oscar Robertson, the first player to ever average a triple-double. His place in history is secure. Of course, we talk about the Cincinnati Royals way back in the 70s, now the NBA's version, Sacramento Kings. His place in history also secure over here. I mean, made his mark with the Cincinnati Royals. Of course, went on to the Milwaukee Bucks to win an NBA title with the all-time great center, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So his place among Cincinnati sports iconism is spectacular. And that's basically the crux of all of Cincinnati sports. But number one is, wasn't, always will be this guy behind me right here, statue, because his legacy, as you can see what's going on around me, is still impactful to this day. It's still second to none to this day. Definitely, his name is etched in history. They're still honoring him day in and day out. And that's why Ezzard Charles will be number one. And it was 78 years ago today that took place down the street in Music Hall. He won the second of his 3 fights against Archie Moore to win the heavyweight championship of the part of that trilogy that took place in the light heavyweight division. Ezzard Charles was certainly one of a kind. Ezzard Charles' place in history is secure. Archie Moore's place is also secure. Just the head-to-head, Ezzard Charles got the better of him 3 times, but there's no shame in that because Ezzard Charles' career just went on long. He got better. Same with Archie Moore. After their trilogy, he went on, he became better, and it's all secure forever and ever, ever. Just 2 terrific light heavyweights. It was 80 years ago today. That took place here in Cincinnati, the second of their 3 fights, and it was just a dandy. 2 all-time great light heavyweights, Ezzard Charles, the Cincinnati Cobra, and Archie Moore, the old Mongoose. Forever secure. We're not going to see anything quite like that again. When you have the stature of 2 of all-time greats at their peak in their division, like these 2 have, we're not going to have that again simply because the business side of boxing, as we know, has just taken over and at times ruined the credibility of the sport. At a time when Charles and Moore were fighting for supremacy and greatness, at a time when they were hands down the 2 greatest light heavyweights ever. Again, subject to opinion, Billy Conn, Michael Spinks, Bob Foster, Harry Greb, and Gene Tunney, among others in the conversation. But the top 2 light heavyweights widely at the time were Ezzard Charles and Archie Moore, and they put on a great clash 8 decades ago today in Cincinnati. And that'll wrap up this special edition of Sirhan on X. I hope everybody out there has themselves a wonderful rest of the 5th of May, 2025. I will be back tomorrow. Until then, have a good night. Take care of yourselves. And remember, always make self-care your number 1 priority in life. Take care of yourself first before you take care of anything else. If you take care of yourself first, good things will follow. If you don't take care of yourself first, nothing else matters. Take care, God bless, and have a good night.